The morning sun bled over the town square, a harsh yellow spilling across the dust-choked streets. The wind carried the sharp tang of sweat and leather, the scent of cattle from the pens beyond, and the faint metallic whiff of blood from yesterday's brawl. Silas stood in the center, ropes binding his wrists, boots scraping the hard earth, heart hammering in his chest. Every eye in the crowd seemed to pierce him, their sneers and muttered judgments cutting deeper than the rope digging into his skin. Here we have a fine young man, barely more than a boy, the auctioneer called, voice booming over the murmurs, now to settle his debts. With Widow Hawthorne, a collective gasp rippled through the spectators. Silas's stomach dropped. Widow Hawthorne, standing tall on the raised platform, watched with an unreadable expression. Her gray-streaked hair glinted in the morning sun. A carved locket rested against her chest, swinging slightly as she shifted her weight. A small, polished token of secrets. Of love lost, perhaps, or promises broken. The whispers began immediately. Twice his age. What fool would consent? She's rich, but he'll be ruined. Each cruel word struck him like stones. He swallowed hard, jaw tight. Shame rolled over him in heavy waves. His hands twitched inside the rope, nails scraping the coarse fiber. The world had reduced him to this. A young man auctioned like livestock, bound by family misfortune and debt. The auctioneer raised his hammer. Do I hear any bids? Silas's gaze found hers. Widow Hawthorne's eyes were calm, steady, but not unkind. There was an edge of curiosity there, a flicker of calculation beneath her composed exterior. The locket gleamed in the sunlight, catching the edges of her secrets and her sorrow. And for the first time, Silas felt something other than fear, a strange, almost imperceptible spark of respect. She carried herself with dignity, despite the scandal surrounding their arrangement. The hammer fell. The sound clanged against the post, final, irrevocable. Silas's freedom disappeared in an instant, traded for a contract neither of them had desired. The crowd erupted into cheers and jeers, stamping boots on the wooden planks, rattling the barrels and crates that lined the square. Faces blurred together, some mocking, some curious, none offering mercy. Silas's mind raced. Anger surged alongside humiliation, but beneath it, curiosity coiled, sharp and alive. Could this woman, twice his age and seemingly untouchable, be more than a prison? Could there be hidden kindness beneath the wealth and iron will? Even in this moment of degradation, he felt the faint stirrings of a possibility, something dangerous perhaps, but worth exploring. The crowd began to disperse, voices fading into the heat-hazed horizon. Silence fell over the auction platform, broken only by the faint creak of rope against wood. Silas's pulse slowed, the adrenaline giving way to calculation. He studied her again. She offered no smile, no reassurance, but her eyes met his in steady defiance. A quiet challenge. He swallowed hard. Humiliation threatened to crush him, but not his fire. In a heartbeat, he resolved he would endure. He would survive. And perhaps, in the shadows of this forced union, he might find something unexpected. Strength, wisdom, or even a glimpse of tenderness. The locket glinted again, bright against her chest. A symbol, small and secret, whispering of stories yet untold. Silas's curiosity and fear merged into one sharp edge. He would need every ounce of courage to navigate the days ahead. The auction square emptied, leaving him and Widow Hawthorne standing alone. Dust swirled around their boots, the sun climbing higher, heat pressing down. Silas lifted his chin, taking the first uncertain step toward the unknown, toward the life that awaited him behind that carved locket, and behind a woman who was more mystery than menace. A question hung in the air. Heavy as the sun, was she a prison or a hidden salvation? Rain came down in sheets, hammering the barren plains with relentless force. The wheels of the rickety carriage sank into the mud, splashing wet earth over Silas's boots. His coat clung to him, soaked through, and the wind cut across his face like a whip. Beside him, Widow Hawthorne sat tall, hair plastered against her skull, eyes sharp and unwavering despite the storm. The carved locket rested against her chest, catching flickers of lamplight from the carriage interior. A small glimmer in the gray tempest. You'd think a boy could survive a little rain, she said. Voice dry, but her lips curved faintly, almost teasing. The corner of her eye caught his, and for the first time since the auction, Silas felt the tension in his chest ease just a fraction. She was hardened, yes, but not cruel. Beneath the stern exterior, there was humor, patience, and a flicker of warmth he hadn't expected. The carriage lurched, threatening to tip, and Silas grabbed the railing, muscles straining. "Hold on," he said, though whether to her or himself, he wasn't certain. Hours passed in a blur of mud, wind, and relentless rain. Then, just as his arms ached and his fingers were numb, a dark shape appeared ahead. A barn, abandoned but sturdy enough to offer refuge. Silas guided the carriage through the sodden field, wheels splashing into deep puddles, until it ground to a halt beneath the sagging roof. Inside, the wind howled through gaps in the walls like a predator, dragging rain across the wooden floor in silver sheets. Silas set to work building a small fire, scavenging dry kindling from a forgotten corner. Sparks leapt into the air, and the lamplight flickered over her face, throwing shadows that softened the sharp angles of her features. The locket caught the glow, glinting against her chest like a tiny beacon, and he found himself staring more than once. "You've been through worse storms," she said quietly, her gaze on the fire. "Bigger than this one, I reckon," he admitted, crouching low to shield the flame. "But I've never been forced to ride through it with a stranger before." He trailed off, unsure if he should add more. She smiled faintly, the first genuine expression he had seen. "We're all strangers at first. Life teaches us who to trust and when." Her words carried weight. They reminded him of his own struggles, the ranch half ruined, the debts, the relentless town whispers. And yet, here they were, two souls thrust together by circumstance, finding some fragile understanding amid chaos. The wind shrieked, rattling the barn's boards, and the first bond formed. Not yet love, but a respect grounded in shared endurance. Night fell heavy, thick with the scent of wet earth and hay. Outside, the plains were alive with rustlers, shadows moving just beyond the firelight. Silas kept watch, rifle close, eyes darting to every creaking timber and shifting shadow. Widow Hawthorne, now seated near the hearth, moved closer under the warmth of the shared fire, a silent truce forming between them. Neither spoke of tomorrow, of what this marriage might mean, or of the future's uncertainties. Words were unnecessary. He stole glances at the locket again, noticing details he had not before. Intricate carvings, tiny initials, a hidden hinge. It seemed to hold the weight of a lifetime, secrets and stories tucked within, much like the woman who wore it. The storm outside battered the barn, but inside, there was fragile safety, trust beginning to take root in the damp. Candle-lit shadows. The hours dragged, punctuated by the hiss of rain and the occasional groan of timbers. Silas's mind wandered, considering the strange, unspoken connection forming. Could a woman twice his age teach him courage? Could he offer her protection without losing his own dignity? Questions remained unspoken, answers still beyond reach. By the time the fire dwindled to glowing embers, the storm had not abated, yet neither felt entirely alone. The barn smelled of wet hay and smoke, the wind moaning like a distant predator. But Silas and Widow Hawthorne shared a quiet understanding. The first day of this forced union ended without conversation, yet something vital had been forged. Tension of survival, tempered by possibility and a sense that perhaps, in the eye of the storm, they might find more than mere refuge. The ranch lay in ruins, a skeleton of its former glory. The fence posts leaned like weary sentinels, and the barns sagged under decades of neglect. Silas moved among the fields with the weight of toil pressing on his shoulders. Each swing of the hoe stirred dust and memories of better days, yet the earth yielded only stubborn weeds. The widow watched from the porch, sharp eyes taking in every faltering step, every crooked fence, every sagging beam. "Move the cattle to the west pen," she called, voice crisp yet steady. "And check the south fence. Don't let them wander into the creek again." Her hands rested on her hips, posture impeccable, but her eyes softened when they met his. There was care beneath the commands, subtle as sunlight glinting through broken boards. Silas bristled at the reminders of his inadequacy, the whispers of the villagers carrying across the fields, judging every move he made. "Barren," they muttered. "Cursed," they hissed. He hated their words, hated the shame, but he could not deny the comforts she quietly brought. Meals warm and nourishing. Fences repaired without fuss, a presence steady and unjudgmental. One afternoon, While tending a patch of overgrown weeds, he noticed her slipping behind the barn. Curiosity tugged him, and he followed. There, hidden behind tangled vines and wildflowers, lay a garden, untended yet alive with resilience. Sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating clusters of flowers fighting for survival among thorns and weeds. "I used to come here when the world felt too heavy," she said softly, noticing him. "A place to remember patience and perseverance." She handed him the locket. "Carry it with you," she said. "A reminder that some things, like hope, require tending." The small gesture was monumental, heavier than any tool he carried in his hands. Silas turned it over slowly, tracing the intricate carvings. He felt a surge of gratitude, irritation, curiosity, and the first threads of admiration for the woman who had been thrust upon him. It was a quiet acknowledgement of trust, a subtle truce in a world that had offered little mercy. The cattle wandered lazily in the fields beyond, unaware of the stakes that hung over the ranch. Their soft lowing echoed across the valley, a lullaby and a warning, foreshadowing challenges yet unseen. Silas repaired fences with renewed vigor, sweat stinging his eyes, muscles aching with purpose. She moved among the chores with him, her hands deft and efficient, her presence guiding without overpowering. Together they transformed the abandoned skeleton into something approaching livable, yet the weight of unease lingered. At night, the barn creaked ominously. Each groan of timber and rustle of straw seemed amplified in the darkness, a reminder that safety was fleeting. The wind whispered through the gaps, carrying the scent of rain from the plains, mingling with the earthy tang of hay and soil. Silas lay awake on a makeshift mattress, rifle close at hand, eyes fixed on the shadows dancing across the rafters. Every noise reminded him that survival demanded more than courage. It demanded vigilance, resilience, and a trust he had yet to fully grant. The widow slept nearby, a quiet presence, her breathing steady despite the creaks and groans. He stole glances at the locket resting on the table, the symbol of patience and perseverance now tethered to their shared world. Gratitude mingled with irritation, admiration with confusion. He was still a boy thrust into a man's responsibilities, yet in her steadiness he saw a guide, a teacher, and perhaps something more. Dawn broke across the plains, gold spilling over the horizon, illuminating the garden behind the barn. The locket caught the first light, glinting like a promise. Silas exhaled slowly, a fragile understanding settling over him. The ranch was still broken, the cattle still restless, and the villagers still whispering, yet for the first time, he felt a tether to this place, to this woman, and to the strange hope that perseverance might yet bloom amid the dust and ruin. Winter crept across the valley, the wind slicing through the plains with icy precision. Frost clung to the barns, and the air carried the sharp tang of smoke and damp earth. Silas shivered beneath the thin blanket, fever burning through him, muscles aching as though the cold had settled into his bones. The widow knelt beside him, hands surprisingly gentle as she lifted a damp cloth and pressed it to his forehead. Each touch lingered a moment too long to be casual, warm and steady against his fevered skin. "You'll break if you lie like this," she said softly, her voice low but firm. Her fingers lingered in his hair as she brushed it back, exposing the faint lines of scars across her hands and neck. He hadn't noticed them before, but now the marks spoke volumes, a history of loss, endurance, and battles fought quietly. For the first time, Silas saw the truth behind the woman he had been forced to marry. She was not iron alone. She was fire tempered by suffering, capable of strength and tenderness in equal measure. The small fire in the hearth glowed, illuminating the carved locket around her neck. It caught the light with a subtle gleam, a silent reminder of trust slowly being built between them. Silas's gaze drifted from her hands to the locket, to her eyes, to the curve of her jaw, noticing the steady patience in every movement. Each silence shared beside the fire was a lesson in endurance, each whispered word a thread in a fragile tapestry of understanding. He began to recognize her as more than a burdensome obligation. She was a teacher of resilience, someone whose intellect and courage elevated him, whose presence offered both challenge and comfort. "Why do you care so much?" he asked one night, voice hoarse from fever and exhaustion. She smiled faintly, brushing ash from the hearth. "Because survival is lonely when shared by none," she said simply. The words held no arrogance, only truth. Silas realized then that her guidance, her quiet patience, had been a gift he had not known he needed. Yet the locket whispered of secrets she refused to share, a weight pressing between them, even as trust grew. Silas touched it absent-mindedly, wondering what stories it held. The battles she had fought, the losses endured, the love once lost. The quiet unease gnawed at him, but he did not speak, understanding that some mysteries were given only in time. Days passed with the rhythm of winter, chores, fire tending, the hush of snow outside, and the low hum of shared labor. Silas felt his fever fade, muscles regaining strength, but the shadow of curiosity grew sharper with each glance at the locket. Each touch from her, each patient gesture, deepened the bond between them. Respect had transformed into something unspoken, a quiet acknowledgement of shared struggle. Then one morning, Silas awoke to the cold bite of empty blankets. The widow was gone. Panic surged, adrenaline sharpening his senses. On the table lay a single note, edges curling in the fire's warmth. "Meet me where the garden begins." The words, so simple yet charged, struck him like a whip. The garden, the hidden sanctuary behind the barn, untouched but alive, waiting like a secret ready to be revealed. A chill ran down his spine, not from the winter air, but from the weight of trust and uncertainty pressing on him. This was the first true test. Could he follow her without question, trusting the fragile bond they had built, even as the unknown threatened? Silas rose, steadying himself on the edge of the bed. The fire crackled, shadows dancing across the walls, the locket gleaming faintly in his pocket, a silent promise of connection and responsibility. Each breath carried the scent of smoke and frost. He wrapped his coat tight, gripped the rifle, and stepped into the cold morning, boots crunching over frost-hardened earth. The barn behind him creaked as if warning of what lay ahead. Silas's heart raced, not with fear alone, but with anticipation. Winter's chill bit at his cheeks, wind whistling across the plains, but he did not falter. Ahead lay the garden, the locket, and the fragile trust that now bound them. Every step forward demanded faith, every glance toward the horizon whispered of challenges yet unseen. Silas exhaled slowly, breath fogging the air, and pushed toward the unknown. He did not know what awaited him in the garden, only that this was a test he could not refuse. And somewhere in the quiet shadow of frost and locket, the first threads of understanding would either hold or snap. The garden lay tangled and wild, sunlight striking through gaps in the overgrown branches, casting golden shafts onto the dirt and untended flowers. Silas stepped carefully over roots and weeds, the familiar scent of earth and damp leaves filling his lungs. He found her kneeling among the blooms, hands brushing aside thorns, tending to the stubborn life that refused to bow to neglect. The locket glinted against her chest, catching the sunlight in a quiet, persistent gleam. "You've kept it here long," he said, voice low, not wanting to disturb the fragile hush. She looked up, eyes meeting his, shadows of the past flickering in their depths. "It reminds me of what's been lost, and what can endure," she said softly. Her voice carried no boast, no bitterness, only quiet acknowledgement. She rose slowly, extending the locket toward him. "Hold it, let it remind you of patience." And of trust. Silas took it, weighty and delicate in his palm. The metal was warm from the sun, and the intricate carving seemed almost alive under his fingers. For a moment, the world narrowed to the two of them, the garden, the sunlight, the glinting locket. And then, in a low, measured confession, she spoke of her past. A love lost too soon, a family betrayed by those who should have protected them, and wealth that came at the cost of solitude and suspicion. Her words were not heavy with sorrow, but edged with lessons learned in pain and endurance. Silas listened, chest tight, heart stirring in a way that was unfamiliar. He had never known hardship like hers, not yet. And yet, in her careful recounting, he saw the echoes of his own struggle, the weight of responsibility, the sting of ridicule, the constant vigilance demanded by a world too harsh to forgive mistakes. He did not speak of love. He spoke instead of loyalty, of protection, of respect. He placed his hand over the locket, over hers, and made the promise silently, as if the world outside could not hear, but the bond could. The locket now held more than ornamentation or secret history. It became a symbol of connection, a tether beyond the contract of marriage. It bound them in understanding, in acknowledgement of shared endurance, in unspoken loyalty. For the first time, the trappings of obligation gave way to something real, fragile, but palpable. But the world beyond the garden was restless. Whispers of the town, once background noise, grew louder, sharpening against their refuge. Villagers pointed, eyes narrowing, tongues wagging. And more dangerous than whispers, a rival rancher watched from a distant ridge, scanning their movements with calculating patience. The tension prickled the air like static before a storm. Desire and suspicion intertwined, each glance carrying unspoken questions. Could they trust one another completely? Could their fragile bond withstand outside interference? Silas's eyes swept the garden, landing on her face, on the locket resting in his palm. He felt a warmth and fear that twisted together, the desire to shield, to understand, to claim trust without damaging it. The wind rustled the leaves, carrying faint distant sounds, cattle lowing. A bird startled from a branch, and then hoofbeats, sharp and urgent, pounding across the earth. The sound made the garden hold its breath. Silas's hand tightened around the locket. She glanced toward the horizon, eyes narrowing, posture tense. Whoever approached was fast, deliberate, and determined. The quiet trust they had begun to build trembled under the weight of the outside world, poised on the edge of disruption. Silas felt the familiar pull of adrenaline, muscles coiling, senses sharpening. The locket warmed in his hand like a talisman, a reminder of the promise he had just made. He did not release it, did not falter, even as his gaze sought the approaching figure. Every instinct screamed caution, yet every heartbeat echoed the fragile bond formed in sunlit shadows and overgrown paths. The chapter closed on a frozen moment, the two of them in the tangled garden, sunlight glinting off the locket, wind tugging at clothes and hair, and the unmistakable sound of hooves striking earth with growing urgency. Trust had been offered, a symbol claimed, and now the story paused, holding its breath. Would the fragile sanctuary of understanding endure, or would the world beyond the garden tear it apart? The afternoon sun hung low over the plains, casting long shadows across the ranch. Silas was tending the fence when a cloud of dust signaled an approaching rider. The rival rancher, broad-shouldered and grim-faced, rode up with practiced ease, his boots striking the stirrups with deliberate clatter. "I've come to talk," he said smoothly, voice carrying the weight of expectation, yet cloaked in civility. Silas narrowed his eyes, sensing the hidden edge beneath the words. The widow stood beside him, calm, her hand resting lightly on the locket around her neck. Sunlight glinted against the carved metal, and Silas noticed it seemed to mock him now, a reminder of trust offered and innocence tested. The rival rancher dismounted, spurs clinking against the dry earth. "I suppose you've heard the whispers," he said, eyes flicking to the widow. "The truth is your fortunes, and your future, miss, well, they're tied to this boy's family land. Should you refuse, the land will be lost." The words struck Silas like a blow. His breath caught, vision narrowing. Every gesture, every act of care, every smile from the widow now seemed suspect. Betrayal roared in his chest, hot and unforgiving. How many moments of kindness had been calculated? How many words spoken were strategy rather than truth? The locket, once warm with connection, now felt cold and heavy in his palm. Silas started, then faltered, jaw tightening. Anger surged through him, mingled with hurt and disbelief. He turned and fled, boots pounding across the dusty yard, heart hammering in rhythm with his rage. The barn loomed ahead, a shadowy refuge from the sudden storm of revelation. He slammed the door behind him, the wooden panels creaking in protest. She followed, footsteps measured, unyielding. "Silas," she said, voice calm but firm, "you think my care was false? You think my actions were all for the land? They were not." Her eyes, steady and piercing, met his, pleading for him to see beyond the surface. Yet his chest ached with doubt, every instinct torn between anger and the desire to believe. He paced the barn, fists clenched, eyes scanning the rafters, the shadows dancing from the flickering fire. He traced the locket with a trembling finger, carving grooves with the tip of his thumb, wishing it could speak truths he could not yet trust. The air was heavy with dust, and the scent of hay mingled with sweat and fear. Secrets unraveled like frayed rope, and in their tangles feelings collided, admiration and resentment, care and suspicion, warmth and mistrust. "I've never lied to you," she said again, softer this time. "Not once. You're my responsibility, my partner in this life, beyond land, beyond whispers." Silas froze, chest tight. Could he believe her? Or would the betrayal he imagined define the fragile bond they had been building? He could feel the weight of the choice pressing down like winter ice, heavy and unyielding. Outside, the plains stretched wide and empty, yet alive with unseen dangers. Night fell, thick and black, settling over the barn. A distant howl split the silence, echoing across the hills and stirring the low grasses. Predators, human or otherwise, lurked in the dark, waiting for weakness, for hesitation. Silas's hand went instinctively to the rifle, then back to the locket. The symbol of trust and connection now felt like a test of endurance, one that would demand every ounce of courage and faith he had. He exhaled slowly, breath fogging in the chill, and turned toward her. Her silhouette was framed by the barn door, standing resolute, hand extended, eyes unwavering. The night held its breath with him, the howl of distant predators a warning that survival was no longer about cattle or fences, but about trust, loyalty, and the fragility of the human heart. The barn walls creaked in the wind, shadows twisting and stretching like specters. Silas's mind raced, to trust, to step forward, to embrace the connection that had been real, or to let anger and suspicion fracture the bond forever. The answer would come with choice, courage, and reckoning. Outside, the howl repeated, closer now, mingling with the wind, carrying the promise of danger, both human and untamed. Silas tightened his grip on the locket, feeling its weight anchor him even as uncertainty clawed at his chest. He had a decision to make, and the night, vast and indifferent, would not wait for hesitation. Spring rains had softened the earth, turning the plains into a churned sea of mud and puddles. Silas rode hard across the fields, boots slipping in the mire, rifle at the ready. His breath came in harsh, visible clouds, mingling with the smell of wet leather and the tang of damp earth. The air was alive with tension. He could feel it in the low rumble of distant hooves. Rustlers, organized, ruthless, approached like shadows cast across the valley. The rival rancher rode at their head, spurs glinting, eyes cold with calculation. Silas's chest tightened, muscles coiled. Every instinct screamed warning. The peace they had fought to build, the trust, the fragile bond, was about to be tested again. Behind him, the widow moved with purpose, boots slapping the wooden floor of the barn, hands deft as she organized. Barricades in her few hired hands. Her presence was a revelation. Strength coiled beneath her calm, courage born from years of survival. "Silas," she called, voice carrying across the rain-slicked yard. "Fences first. Keep the cattle from scattering." He swung the rifle, heart hammering, mud splashing up from the churned ground. Sparks of fire from torches and burning fence posts dotted the storm-darkened fields. The locket swung from his neck, a bright glimmer against the gray, a token of hope and memory, a tether to the bond they had forged. Each glance at it steeled him, reminded him of loyalty, trust, and the promise to protect. The rustlers surged forward, shouting and brandishing weapons. Silas met them head-on, hands tight on the rifle, movements precise despite fatigue. He could hear her commands over the chaos, feel her presence at his side, organizing defenses, directing the few men and women willing to fight. She was far more than a wealthy older bride. She was a strategist, a force of resolve, her eyes bright with determination. Their teamwork grew seamless. Silas blocked a thrust from a rustler, pivoted and fired, while she guided others to secure the livestock. Every glance shared between them carried unspoken words: respect, understanding, trust. And beneath it, something subtler, yet undeniable: love, tempered by adversity, forged in shared danger and sweat-soaked determination. Hours passed in a blur of mud, firelight, and shouted commands. Rain's slicked hair clung to Silas's forehead. His arms ached, yet he moved with unwavering purpose. Smoke curled through the yard, tangling with the scent of wet earth and gunpowder. The locket caught glimpses of firelight with every movement, glinting like a heartbeat. A symbol of the bond that neither the auction, the storms, nor betrayal could sever. Dawn finally broke, pale gold spilling across the drenched fields. The smoke thinned, revealing the battered fences, scattered cattle, and the rival ranchers' retreating figures. Victory was partial. The enemy was not vanquished, only repelled. Silas's chest heaved, muscles trembling with exhaustion, yet his gaze found her. She stood resolute, mud-streaked, hair plastered to her face, eyes bright and unyielding. Respect had ripened into something stronger. a quiet, fierce love that needed no declaration in words. But as the sun climbed higher, a shadow lingered on the ridge. Dark, immovable, deliberate. The rustlers may have retreated, but the rival rancher's presence remained, a looming promise of the ultimate confrontation. Survival, love, and justice were poised on a knife's edge. Silas tightened his grip on the locket, the symbol of trust and courage, feeling the weight of everything at stake. The barn creaked behind them, wind rustling through the battered fence, and the valley held its breath. The showdown was yet to come. Every scar, every battle, every shared glance had led to this moment, the test of heart and will, of loyalty and love, of what it truly meant to survive and to fight for each other. The locket glinted one last time in the early light, catching the shadow on the ridge. Silas squared his shoulders, eyes narrowing. They had endured storms, betrayal, and rustlers. Now the ultimate trial awaited, and neither he nor the widow would falter. The ridge loomed above the ranch like a silent sentinel, jagged and imposing, the early sun glinting off wet rocks and muddied grass. Silas crouched behind a toppled fence, rifle pressed against his shoulder, eyes scanning the advancing figures. The rival rancher rode at the forefront, spurs gleaming, face hard as flint. Behind him, his men fanned out, boots sinking into mud, weapons raised, intent clear. Every heartbeat thrummed with tension. Beside him, the widow moved with deliberate grace, directing the few defenders they had rallied. Her voice cut through the air like a whip, precise commands met with immediate action. She was more than strategy. She was courage incarnate, the spine of their resistance. Silas felt the old admiration shift into something heavier, something fiercer. Love tempered by battle, forged in fire and fear. The first shot rang out, sharp and unrelenting, echoing across the valley. Chaos erupted. Silas moved with practiced precision, rifle rising and falling, his body tense with survival instinct. The locket swung from his neck, catching the sunlight, then slipped free during a tumble, landing in the dirt. He froze for a heartbeat, heart hammering. Dirt clung to its intricate carvings, yet instinctively he swept it up, clutching it like a talisman. It symbolized more than trust. It was their bond, nearly lost, yet salvaged through resolve and resilience. The rival rancher pressed forward, fury in his eyes, and Silas found himself shielding the widow, body moving before thought. She, in turn, commanded the defenders, organizing counterattacks with unyielding precision. Each movement mirrored the others. He protected, she directed, she empowered, he endured. Together, they became a force neither humiliation, betrayal, nor assault could diminish. Gunfire cracked across the ridge, dirt and smoke curling into the wind. Silas ducked behind a fallen post, watching a rustler fall, heart racing, fingers tight around the rifle. He stole a glance at the widow. She stood tall, hair plastered to her face, mud streaked across her cheeks, eyes blazing with determination. In that instant, every past fear, the auction, the storms, the betrayals, seemed to converge into a single sharp clarity. Survival was no longer enough. They had to endure for each other, to claim the agency life had threatened to steal. Minutes stretched like hours. Decisions carried life or death, love or loss. A rustler charged from the side, and Silas moved, instinct and promise propelling him. He blocked the swing, twisting, firing. She directed a counterattack, voice unwavering. The ridge shook with the rhythm of battle, the air filled with smoke, shouts, and the tang of sweat and gunpowder. At last, the rival rancher faltered, his men scattering under the coordinated defense. Silas's chest heaved, mud streaked across his skin, rifle lowered. The widow stepped forward, eyes fierce, commanding silence and respect. The threat was vanquished, their home reclaimed, their lives and agency restored. Silence fell over the valley. Smoke curled upward, dissipating into the morning sky, and the town watched from a distance, hushed and awed. They had witnessed humiliation overturned, betrayal confronted, and assault repelled. The auction boy and the widow, unlikely pair, judged and whispered about, had survived and emerged stronger, bound not by obligation but by shared courage and respect. Later, the garden awaited, tangled yet alive. The locket glinted faintly in Silas's pocket, a reminder of trials endured and promises kept. He stepped beside her, hands brushing, then entwining, fingers locking as naturally as breath. They moved through the overgrown blooms, sunlight warming their shoulders, the earth still damp and fragrant. Words were unnecessary. Eyes spoke what hearts could not yet voice aloud. Gratitude, admiration, and quiet affection lingered in every glance, every gesture. The wind whispered through the wildflowers, rustling the leaves like applause for the unseen, enduring victory. The locket, finally at rest, rested against his chest, glinting as it had through storms and fever, chaos and gunfire. It was more than a symbol now. It was a testament. They stood together in the sanctuary of overgrowth and sunlight, the world reduced to their shared presence. For all the humiliation, betrayal, and danger they had endured, survived, and claimed something rarer than wealth or land. Trust, loyalty, and a love born of trials and quiet courage. The garden, once hidden and wild, now mirrored the strength that had grown between them. Fragile, yet unbreakable. Seasons had turned, and the valley breathed in the slow rhythm of renewal. Spring had yielded to summer, and the garden behind the barn, once tangled and wild, now flourished with life. Wildflowers pushed through soft soil, petals swaying in the warm breeze, colors bright against the faded brown of old fence posts. The scent of earth and growth lingered, sweet and reassuring, carrying with it the promise of endurance. The locket hung once more around her neck, catching the sunlight with a soft gleam. Silas, riding beside her across the plains, could see the subtle shift it had undergone in meaning. It was no longer a talisman of obligation or a weight of secrets. It had become a shared emblem, a symbol of trust, love, and survival. Each glance at it reminded him of fevered nights, rustlers' gunfire, whispered confessions, and battles fought side by side. The locket had traveled from suspicion to connection, carrying the weight of every trial and triumph. The town, once cruel and judgmental, now watched from porches and dusty windows as Silas guided his horse through the sunlit streets. Whispers of derision had been replaced with nods of acknowledgement, silent respect for the boy who had endured, and the widow who had refused to bend under the weight of ridicule. They recognized quiet strength when it could not be ignored. The auction that had once humiliated him, the betrayal that had nearly broken trust, all had become distant echoes, shadows softened by time and resolve. Silas rode with shoulders squared, boots settling into stirrups as if claiming not only the land but his own growth. He was no longer the calloused, trembling boy dragged into a marriage that humiliated him. He was a man tempered by hardship, by survival, by the trials of love and loss. Each stride of the horse carried him further from the past, closer to the life he had chosen, not the one forced upon him. Beside him, the widow's smile was quiet, subtle, yet luminous. It carried warmth, understanding, and shared history, a reflection of all they had endured. Their hands brushed, then entwined, fingers locking as naturally as the rhythm of the wind through the tall grasses. Words were unnecessary. Their connection spoke volumes in glances, in the ease of touch, in the simple act of being together after storms, betrayals, and battle. The ridge beyond the plains glowed softly in the late afternoon light. Shadows receded, leaving the golden haze of sun over earth that had been fought for, earned, and reclaimed. Silas breathed in the warm air, carrying hints of hay, wildflowers, and distant river water. Each scent, each sound, the creak of fence posts, the whisper of leaves, the low hum of cattle, was a reminder that life had endured, reshaped but unbroken. A bird perched atop a fence post, its feathers ruffling in the gentle breeze, chirping softly as if marking the end of their long journey. Silas noticed it, smiled, and shifted slightly, brushing a hand along the widow's, feeling the warmth and steadiness of her presence. Freedom had been won in small victories, the reclamation of land, the quiet courage in a gaze, the unspoken bond forged in hardship. Love, too, had been claimed, quiet but enduring, chosen rather than forced. Together, they walked through the garden, sunlight spilling over wildflowers and stone paths. The locket glimmered between them, reflecting a shared history, a promise kept, and the trials that had transformed them. It was no longer a symbol of fear or obligation. It was a testament to endurance, trust, and love earned through fire and wind, storm and struggle. Silas's eyes met hers, a soft acknowledgement of gratitude and affection. The town may have watched, judgment softened into respect, but this moment belonged only to them. Two souls who had faced humiliation, betrayal, and danger, and emerged not merely unbroken, but stronger, bonded, and ready for whatever the horizon might bring. The bird chirped once more, wings flicking in the sun, as if the world itself acknowledged their journey. And in the gentle light across the ridge, the echoes of hardship dissolved into a quiet promise: freedom. Love and resilience, intertwined and enduring,